Memory and War.
Yeah. Oh, there we go.
And we are live. It worked. We're not 15 minutes fashionably late again.
I know, thank goodness.
Right on time. So yeah, we got a minute or two to let people get ready. So
which old box have you all been going to when you've gotten some to-go beers from there?
What's that?
The Old Ox is at the Harris Teeter.
Oh, you can get it at the grocery store.
You can get it at the grocery store. It's a great opportunity to pick up local brews. If you check out the beer section, you can often find a local beer.
Yeah, I stopped by the Old Ox in Middleburg, and they have window service, which is nice. You just walk up and pay right there. So.
You can also get food, I think, in Middleburg.
Yes, they're doing food as well.
Yeah, Vanish had a sign up saying that they're doing food trucks on, I don't know, was it Fridays and Saturdays or Saturdays and Sundays too, in addition to their to-go beers. I'll be curious to see what people are drinking tonight. I need more people chiming in. You're going to be tuning in. I'm curious what kind of beer they're drinking.
That's right. As always, let us know what you're drinking and where you're watching from. We love to know.
We don't discriminate.
PA represent.
I got a man too. Putting my quarantine time to good use and driving everyone in my house crazy.
So are the Pennsylvania laws, have they stopped all the breweries, Jeff?
That's a really good question. I don't know what the situation with the breweries is. I think that they're still producing and that you can get things to go, but beer and wine you can mostly pick up at grocery stores now. Spirits are, unless you happen to live near a distillery, there's no way to get them.
Wow.
Usually that stuff is all done through the state stores and they are completely shut down. So
I feel like it started off as like an April Fool's joke where on April 1st, everything was posting saying, all the liquor stores are closed. And then it became like a nightmare for everyone where it actually happened.
Yeah, we're living it, man. So hearing you guys talk about your excellent local scene is really killing me.
We do have an excellent local scene.
Yeah.
I admit it is most excellent.
Well, once you're able to travel down here, you can come visit us and we'll take you around to all of our favorite spots.
I would love to.
With that,
sounds like a dream.
It's 7 o'clock. We should go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. This is the latest installment of Historians on Tap. My name is Travis Shaw. I'm with the Mosby Heritage Area Association. And over on my left, I guess, is Anne-Marie Paquette. Anne-Marie. Also with the Mosby Heritage Area Association, we also have Joe Rizzo, director of the Loudoun Museum. And our special guest tonight is a good friend of mine, longtime friend of mine, Jeff Tolbert. He's a professor of folklore and American studies at Penn State, Harrisburg. So tonight we're going to be talking about myth, history, legend, kind of where all these things intersect and how historical fact gets bound up in folk tales and, how this kind of culture of folk tales and folklore evolved in our area. So we've all got some really cool stories to share. Jeff's going to give his professional opinion on this and some professional context, background to all of this. So it should be a really fun night, something a little different from what we've done in the past. So we'll go around real quick. Anne-Marie, what are you drinking tonight?
Tonight I am drinking Golden Ox from Old Ox Brewery, and this is actually from a pack that I got at a local grocery store. So there are plenty of ways to find local brews, support local businesses that are also very convenient. So thanks, Old Ox.
What about you, Joe?
I am drinking Wraith from Vanish Brewery here in Leesburg. Very
appropriate
for tonight. It's probably my favorite beer that Vanish has there. So it's a good choice for tonight with Wraith, a mythical figure on there. I didn't realize it also matches my shirt. That is not planned, but maybe we're at the stage of quarantine where I'm starting to dress like what I drink. I don't know, but unplanned. But I also will say as well, a shout out to the Chamber of Commerce Lead Share group that I'm in with Loudoun County. They are doing a virtual watch along happy hour for History on Tap tonight.
Fantastic. All right, Jeff, what are you drinking tonight?
Well, so I'm up here in central Pennsylvania, and one of our most famous local breweries is Tröegs, which is out of Hershey, Pennsylvania, right up the road from me, about 6 miles. So I'm drinking Tröegs Hopback Amber Ale, which is
Ooh.
it's nice. It's a little bit of a darker ale, but it's got a nice, as the name suggests, kind of a bite to it.
Nice.
Cheers.
So I'm mixing things up a little tonight. I'm actually drinking a cider. This is Hatch from Wild Hare Cidery. They've got locations in Warrenton, Leesburg, Middleburg. This is their basic cider. It's their heritage dry made from local apples. You know, it's very traditional
yummy.
South cider. But if you like to try different things, they've got some really unusual ones. They've got a great one with like grapefruit and hops. They've got one, was it like blackberry and lime that we had last time we were there, Anne-Marie?
Something like that.
So they have some kind of fun, funky flavors. So I definitely recommend trying them out. Cool. Well,
And
now
also,
that we've done,
Travis, not to interrupt, Benji, too, we've got Andrea behind the scenes again, checking the comment sections as well. And we think tonight especially might get a lot of questions or comments as we're doing a little more conversational. But besides letting us know what you're drinking, definitely will take a lot of questions if you have any about any of the stories we tell or want Jeff's opinion on anything.
yeah, I think this is a topic where we might get a lot of personal stories, you know, things that people have heard, experienced, seen. So hopefully,
Oh, that's totally my language, man. That'd be great.
Send
Well,
us your spookiest tales.
yeah.
Yes, please.
Speaking of your language, Jeff, I think myself and a lot of the other people who are watching probably don't necessarily have a clear idea of what a folklorist does. So tell us a little bit about like what you do aside from teaching.
Yeah, that's the eternal question. I always joke that I do not play banjo at the county fair, despite the images that the word folklorist might conjure for some people. Yeah, Travis has that.
There you go, banjo.
Travis happens to do that every summer, though.
Yeah, so folklore is an actual academic discipline, believe it or not. I didn't just make that up. We have close historic ties to anthropology, at least here in the United States. European folklore study has a little bit of a different history, although there is a connection there. Initially in the English-speaking world, beginning in the early 19th century, folklore was really kind of a gentleman's pastime. It was originally referred to as popular antiquities. It wasn't until the well, I'm embarrassed to say, I forget the exact date, but in the first half of the 19th century that a guy named William Toms coined the term folklore in English to replace what had been called popular antiquities. And it was mostly concerned with collecting examples of narratives and material culture that were felt to kind of represent the true spirit of the people, which really meant the European peasantry, which often were felt to have kind of preserved vestiges of earlier cultural forms, which were part of the common cultural heritage of the nation. Folklore as a field is really closely tied to building the nation state as the primary political unit. So for a long time, folklorists were engaged in that kind of thing, collecting stories of various kinds and classifying them in different ways and carving them up into their smallest constituent units and charting the diffusion of those stories and those pieces of stories across time and space. There was a whole approach that was called the Finnish school, or the Historic Geographic School of Folklore Study, that kind of went out of favor in the first half of the 20th century. But that characterized a lot of what folklorists did for a really long time. But then beginning with the rise of anthropology as a discipline in the United States and the influence of Franz Boas, a very famous anthropologist, the emphasis sort of started very gradually to shift to what people actually do in their real lives. And I'll spare you the boring disciplinary history, but by the end of the 20th century and moving up to the present, most folklorists in the US have really become ethnographers first and foremost. That is to say, we go where people are and we work with them and we live with them and we conduct participant observation. We do with them whatever it is that they're doing in order to learn more about their lives. And we understand folklore as a particular mode of culture. We often call it expressive culture. But it's something that everyone does. It's not just the province of rustic or antiquated peoples on the fringes of society, as the term was originally invoked. Rather, folklore is just sort of a register of cultural expression that we're all engaged in all the time. So we can speak of digital folklore, we can speak of material folklore, we can speak of all different kinds of folklore as things that people are doing in normal daily life, including all of us.
Yeah, so that's a lot deeper than, when I hear the term folklore, I think like kind of some of the stuff we're going to be talking about tonight, like superstition, maybe supernatural stories, like ghost stories, stuff like that. I think in at least in my everyday usage of the term, like that's what I think of, like fairy tales, things like that, fables.
We do.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
We've banded that about here privately, but that's exactly what I'm imagining is, some of what we're talking about here is the unmasking of some of these, these stories, these tales.
Well, yeah, so there's actually entirely space at the folklore table for all of those things. And those are some of the things that I study in my own work. I'm primarily interested in belief. So the supernatural is a big part of that. I teach a course right now called The History of Monsters, Aliens, and the Supernatural. And I think I'll be teaching it every semester until I die.
I would take that class.
Yeah, sign me up.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, but so the difference is really a difference in perspective. So like when we say folklore, we don't mean a kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, we just mean a kind of expression, a way of communicating and participating in culture that is usually thought of as informal and ordinary. We also call it vernacular culture, which when we use the term vernacular, it just means ordinary or common.
Vernacular
to differentiate it from
stuff, yeah.
What was that?
Oh, I said like vernacular architecture kind of.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
So ghost stories are a big part of that for many people.
So I guess like my question before we really get started in some of these stories is, by examining these stories with kind of a critical eye towards folklore, what can we learn about people in the past through these kinds of stories?
Well, I think one of the most obvious answers to that, and I know something that you all are interested in, is it can illustrate the sort of incursion of different cultural factors into an area, because people do move and they do bring aspects of their cultures with them, and they interact with new cultures, and new forms are born out of those interactions. So that's one answer. Another answer is we can begin to understand how people made sense of things in their worlds, not just necessarily in a purely ideological sense, like I don't understand something, so I'm going to pretend or assume that a spirit did it, although sometimes that may happen. But I think ghosts and the supernatural can also speak to other things that are important in people's personal maps of reality. I like to use a lot of spatial metaphors. And beliefs about personal experiences with the supernatural oftentimes represent a big difference from sort of religiously contained approaches to the supernatural. It's very different to sit in a church and hear a sermon about a distant God than it is to be wandering alone in a dark place at night and hear the scream of a banshee. Those are two very, very different kinds of experiences, but they speak to what has been called the numinous, that feeling of awe and also fear that characterizes a lot of religious or sacred experiences.
Cool. Well, I'm actually glad you said banshee, because that reminds me of one of the stories I think Anne-Marie is going to talk about now. So tell us about our local banshee situation here, Anne-Marie.
Well, I wanna save the banshee for a couple minutes. I thought I might start instead by talking a little bit about the most famous ghost, which is of course the gray ghost here in Northern Virginia, being John Singleton Mosby. So himself not necessarily a supernatural figure, but one that I think is very familiar to all of us, both based in fact and based in, kind of lore, based in some of these kind of tall tales that sometimes get bandied around about John Singleton Mosby. So Mosby, of course, was the leader of the 43rd Battalion during the Civil War, leading a Confederate force of partisan rangers, and they very popularly made life hell for Union forces trying to move around this area by staging raids, both taking their horses, supplies, taking their soldiers prisoner. Mosby's main goal, of course, was to tie up as many resources as possible so the Union Army couldn't use them elsewhere, actually waging battles further south or further west. But Mosby himself really took on kind of a persona beyond himself. And that happened, of course, while he was operating from 1863 to 1865 here in this area. But he became kind of more of this legendary figure, I think, after his death. And if there was one person that was kind of responsible for it, that would have been Virgil Carrington Jones, who was from this area, and who wrote one of the first really comprehensive looks at John Mosby in the 20th century, which was, of course, Ranger Mosby, published in 1944. And it was this glamorized edition of Mosby's exploits. And in his book, the Union Army, they're all idiots, right? They're all cowards and idiots. No one is smarter or cooler than John Singleton Mosby. And it becomes this kind of pop culture phenomenon. It inspires that book, and then Grey Ghosts and Rebel Raiders, written about 10 years later, it inspires a TV series, which aired in just for 1 year, for less than a year, 1957 to 58, but they created 39 episodes. So all of my Netflix lovers out there, can imagine a 39 episode season of something, and it was all about John Mosby. Very Hollywoodized. He's wearing this like beautiful double-breasted blazer, definitely not military inspired. And he's this like really hunky, barrel-chested guy, which of course John Mosby was smaller and leaner and a little sharper. But he got the Hollywood treatment. There's a John Mosby board game that Travis can attest to, that there's one or two copies that exist in our office.
There was a comic book series.
Yeah, there's a book series. There's an organization named after him that pays people to get on the internet at night and drink beer. So there's a really fun phenomenon there. There's even, so this is kind of a deep cut. I don't know if any of you guys are Batman fans, but in a 1992 animated series episode, there is a character called the Grey Ghost, who it turns out that Bruce Wayne, as a child, used to watch this black and white TV show, The Grey Ghost, who becomes his hero.
Played by Adam West in that episode.
Yes, voiced by Adam West. You're absolutely right. So
that's one of my favorite episodes.
There you go. And of course, in that universe, the Grey Ghost is kind of this stand-in for TV heroes of yesteryear, but it just so happens they choose the name the Grey Ghost. Probably not intentionally harkening back to John Mosby, but so there you go. There's this idea of this person has permeated, through culture in ways that I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize. But even closer to Mosby's time, when Virgil was putting together these stories about Mosby, he was partially relying on eyewitness testimony from Mosby's children, specifically Stuart, one of Mosby's and Pauline's daughters. And so we see some of these tales of Mosby's exploits already being given a heroic spin, within a few decades of his death. One of the most popular stories that is often discussed here in the Heritage area is this, I'm going to make a pun here, a close shave that Mosby has at a barbershop in Warrenton. And the story goes, the Virgil paints this beautiful picture where you're in downtown Warrenton, it's war-torn Warrenton, right? And then this beautiful Victoria rolls by, this carriage rolls by, and a distinguished older gentleman, tips his hat at the passerbys, and riding behind him is this young woman in a flowing pink poplin dress. Very specific, a lot of details. later on, the observer goes to the barber shop and pulls out a checkers set and starts playing checkers. And while he's playing checkers, that same distinguished gentleman comes in who is recognized as James Hathaway, who owns a very prominent home nearby. And this young woman, it turns out, is Pauline Mosby, the wife, of course, of John Singleton Mosby, who is running amok over all the Yankees in this area. So Mrs. Mosby daintily waltzes into this barber shop and leaves a package for the barber's wife. The barber, meanwhile, is very distracted because he is trimming the hair of a sandy-haired gentleman in his chair. Shortly after Pauline departs, a group of New Yorkers, New York Yankees, not the Yankees, but soldiers, come into the barber shop and start accosting the barber about, where is John Mosby? We have heard that he was in the area. Thinking quickly, the barber pulls the lever on the chair, leveling the barber chair, right? So the person in the chair is now laying down, and quickly lathers shaving cream on the gentleman's face and insists he has no idea where Mosby is. And in fact, this guy in the chair, his name is Hiram Johnson, and he butchers hogs. Satisfied, the Union soldiers leave. And we're left to assume here that the man in the chair is actually John Singleton Mosby, and he has escaped, by a hair on his chinny chin chin, whatever it is. But there are no other records, no other accounts of whether this incident actually took place. Because there were no arrests made, we don't have an account from any of the Union soldiers, right? And Mosby himself doesn't write about this incident, but there are plenty of, more personal or his off-duty time things that he doesn't write about. But there was a very similar incident that, again, I think a lot of us are familiar with, those of us who know the Mosby stories, but don't realize how the two, may be connected or may have subbed in for each other. So Mosby formally organized the 43rd Battalion, Company A, on June 10th of 1863. And of course, as soon as he organizes a company, he takes them on a raid to test them, right, to get them started. On June 10th, 1863, they meet in Atoka at the Rector House. He initiates Company A, and then he takes everybody to Seneca Mills. And he's going there because there's a group of Michiganders there who seem like they're easy prey. Plus, Mosby has never taken his Rangers up to Maryland. So this is going to be a kind of a test for them. Even though the Michiganders were aware, like they somehow caught wind that Mosby was coming, Mosby is able to come in. They capture something like 27 horses, several prisoners. They end up having a couple of fatalities, the Rangers do, but overall it's a successful mission. And they come back that night. The next day they disperse to where they are holing up in their safe houses. So they've just had this initial thing. They went on a successful raid. Finally, they get back and they're able to go to their respective homes. Mosby at this point is staying with James Hathaway at Western View. And Pauline is also there. So Pauline has come to Virginia and is staying at this safe house with Mosby. In the middle of the night, a different group of Union soldiers, so not the Michiganders that they raided, this is actually the 1st New York, who are stationed in Berryville. They're on a sweep looking for Mosby, and they come to Western View in the nighttime. They come knocking on the door, they arrest James Hathaway, the host, and they go upstairs and they find Pauline Mosby in her nightie, no less, and some spurs, but no Mosby. They cannot find Mosby, and this is all supported by the records left by Ezra Bailey, who was with the 1st New York. So they leave. And it's that point that Mosby climbs in the window because he was hanging out in the chestnut tree there for hours, something like 4 to 6 hours. He was waiting in this tree. So again, just as insane as having, Union officers bust in while you're getting shaved, but this one is actually corroborated. Here's where the coincidence comes in. The next morning, so the 12th of June, the same New Yorkers who weren't able to capture Mosby, they ride into Middleburg, where they discover Captain Willie Foster of Company A of Mosby's battalion in line at a barber shop in Middleburg. So here we have a connector between Mosby getting a close call, almost getting caught, and someone else is found out at a barber shop. So in my mind, this may be an example of those two things kind of getting melded together, or the association being made. So that's my first kind of ghost story lore thing. But as far as a supernatural element, this is something that I was kind of casually looking into, thought it would be kind of a fun segue, and then of course I got sucked down the rabbit hole, as I know Joe and Travis, and I'm sure you do too, Jeff. When you find something fun, you end up getting kind of sidetracked. So there is a park nearby in Loudoun County, south of Leesburg, called Banshee Reeks. It's the largest parcel of land owned by the county in the park system, which I did not know until I Googled it. And it's this really great tract of land down on Goose Creek, again, so east of Oatlands, on the Goose Creek, where the Goose Creek forks. You can vote. They have over 20 miles of trails. A lot of it is low-lying because it's on the creek, so some wetlands there, some hills. It's a really neat spot. And according to, again, local legends, the region got its name. It's called Banshee Reeks, and it's called that because, according to myth, in the early 1800s, the owner of the property was coming home from Leesburg. He had stopped at a tavern on the way home, and when he finally made it home, inebriated and in the dark, he, was hearing these ghostly sounds and these misty vapors, and so he named it Banshee Reek. So a banshee, for what we understand of a banshee, as being a female spirit that makes loud noises, and then reeks, not being for the smell, but being for an archaic use of the term, which means misty, mists or veils, mysterious spookiness. So Banshee Reeks being like the banshee's veil, ooh, kind of a thing. And this was interesting to me because in looking at some of the property record references, usually that story is attributed to Jordan B. Luck, who was born in Caroline County and probably moved to this area after 1820, 1830, somewhere in there. We know that he dies there at the property, what is now Banshee Reeks, in 1853. And his wife continues to live there for several years. But the Lucks were from a Tidewater family and had been in Virginia for a few generations already. So I didn't understand, I wasn't sure, is that where the story came from? Who was there before that in the early 1800s who might have had a banshee, experience? So I was just checking through to see who else might have been there, and I discovered that in 1755, Robert Carter, who of course owned the Oatlands tract, which then included a wide circle of property around it, he actually leased 190 acres of what is now Banshee Reeks. He leased it to an indentured Englishman whose name was Joseph Phillis. Joseph Phillis had been born in Kent at the end of the 17th century. He was in the Royal Navy, and his son was born in Ireland. So the family had spent some time in Ireland before coming over to Virginia and indenturing with Robert Carter on this piece of land. So they were there for about 20 years before the family relocated to Pennsylvania, I assume, once the indenture was concluded. But, and I posit this to the audience as a suggestion of who would know, more about coming home drunk than a sailor, than an English sailor who may have lived in Ireland at one time. So making that suggestion that perhaps it was Joseph Phillis who heard the banshee in the reeks coming home from a tavern late one night in Loudoun, in Leesburg. What was in Fairfax technically. But I thought that Jeff might be able to tell us more about banshees and why might how might someone have heard a banshee here in the Reeks?
Wow, well, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. But I think you put your finger on a couple of important things, Anne-Marie, including I mentioned before that in earlier days of the discipline, folklorists were really concerned with tracing individual components of different kinds of narratives as they spread over time and space. And I think both of the examples that you just gave, both the Mosby legends and also the story of Banshee Reeks, probably include elements of that, fragments of other stories being recontextualized in new places. That definitely, of course, does happen as people move from place to place and continue telling stories, but in new contexts. So banshees in Ireland are primarily associated with particular old Irish houses, that is to say, old families. And they were sort of beneficent spirits in that they didn't cause any harm to people. Rather, they would appear and weep and wail as a harbinger of an encroaching death in the family. So they were not necessarily place-bound, but they were very bound to particular people in Irish tradition. The word banshee literally means woman of the she, or woman of, depending on what translation of the word she you take, it could mean like the other world in sort of a general sense, or it's also a word that is used for the old megalithic burial mounds that are found all over Ireland that have through the centuries become associated with Irish fairy tradition. So literally a banshee is a woman of the she, or a woman of the fairies, or a woman of the other world. So to think of a banshee just sort of casually hanging out in the woods in Northern Virginia is, I mean, who's to say, maybe they were on vacation, but it does represent a little bit of a difference from Irish tradition.
Yeah.
But then again, you yourself, you pointed out a possible link to Irish culture that seems perfectly plausible. I mean, that's a way in which the idea of a banshee could have been quite literally imported to the US. And in the absence of other information, when we have weird experiences, we slot them into the interpretive frameworks that we have. So I think you really, again, you kind of put your finger on how those processes of diffusion work and how they can be really clearly seen, especially in this instance of personal experience. When we study the supernatural in folkloristics, that's like the fancy word for the discipline, folkloristics. We are very focused on the issue of personal experience. Not to say that we accept personal encounters at face value. We don't automatically believe, oh, clearly you saw a banshee.
Right.
Rather, we begin from the perspective that experience has validity in people's lives, and that it carries a lot of evidentiary weight that other things don't necessarily do. I mean, we can, cite statistics about Irish banshee legends out of a textbook, and that probably will be less compelling to someone than if they're walking alone through Banshee Reeks and they hear the sound. That's a pretty compelling experience to have. So we try to pay attention to those experiences, and we try to kind of bracket the interpretation of the experiences until a little bit later. One of the most famous examples of this is from a folklorist named David Hufford, who wrote a book called The Terror That Comes in the Night, which I think is like the greatest title for a book ever, in which he kind of broke the lid open on the phenomena that we all know now as sleep paralysis.
Mm-hmm.
He was working in Canada at Memorial University up in Newfoundland, and he encountered a tradition there that he kind of referred to as the old hag tradition. People there would report this experience of being asleep and waking up and feeling as though they're paralyzed. They can only move maybe their eyes. They might feel a weight pressing down on them, and a sense of fear, a sense of an ominous presence. He actually constructed a whole list of primary and secondary characteristics associated with this phenomenon. Later, Hufford realized that people all over the world were reporting experiences, and had been for centuries, that had the exact same or very close characteristics associated with them, whether or not there was an existing cultural framework of belief. So in some places there may be a belief, I'm making this up, but for example, there may have been a belief that a ghost could do this to you at night. But he found too that in other places where there was no such existing belief, there was no supernatural framework to explain this, people were still having the same experience. So Hufford concluded that that this old hag experience, as he called it, was actually a combination of two physiological or neurological processes. One is sleep paralysis, and one is something called hypnagogic hallucination. And he never discounted the supernatural. He didn't say that there isn't a spirit attacking you. Rather, what he said, well, this is when you have this experience, this is what's happening to your body.
Mm-hmm.
These are the parts that we can kind of isolate and see appearing in all these different encounters all over the place. A simpler example that Hufford also gives in that book of why this approach matters is he talks about legends of the Kraken and how, you know, for many, many centuries, sailors told of these giant tentacled monsters that would attack ships, and people would find whale carcasses with sucker scars on them from these impossibly huge beasts. Well, we of course know now that not only does an animal called the giant squid actually exist, but in fact, another species called the colossal squid actually does exist. So this is Hufford's way of kind of indicating that we should not dismiss experiences that people may interpret as supernatural out of hand because of our own biases and our own beliefs. So to return to the Banshee Reeks story, there may very well be, you know, an explanation tied to the local environment, as you sort of suggested. I think that makes a lot of sense. But it's a good sort of folkloric practice to approach that experience from the perspective of, well, we don't know precisely what happened yet. That would require a lot of historical detective work. But we'll begin from the assumption that something did happen, and we'll set aside the interpretation for a moment, and we'll kind of piece together what did happen, which I think you've done really effectively. I think you have a really plausible account for what may have occurred.
Making my case. In the meantime, if anyone is wandering around drunk outside and hears a banshee, let us know.
You don't have to be drunk to hear a banshee.
It could help. I mean, I don't know. I
It
don't
might
want to.
help.
I don't want
It
to
might
ruin
help.
the experiment here.
We've gotten a few good questions in already, and a good comment that the old hag experience would make a great band name. That's a
Just wait till I get this banjo down. That's the name of
That's
the band
right. The
right
old
there.
hag. We're
Travis
gonna
Shaw,
copyright
the old
that.
hag experience. I like
so
that.
yeah, definitely agree with that comment. And then we've got a couple of questions I'll push off to a little bit. But Mike Frawling asks, how do historians use and interpret myth, legend, and folklore? And I feel like we're kind of showing then all our stories, and I've got ones that, I mean, my whole research background is on looking at basically myths that are created intentionally and how that impacted how people viewed current politics, for example. But Jeff, do you have any comments too about how history correlates with folklore and what you study?
Well, I think these examples also speak really strongly to the local connection that is so often an important part in folk narratives. When we study folk narratives in particular, we tend to break them down into like approximately 4 main categories or genres, depending on who you ask. The main genres of narrative that have been studied by folklorists are myth, legend, folk or fairy tale, and personal narrative. Now, I'm kind of eclipsing some other little subgenres and variations that pop up from time to time, but those are kind of the 4 largest categories. And they're characterized, there are a number of things that differentiate one genre from another, but one of the main things is the issue of belief, or what I call the atmosphere of belief surrounding each of these tales or types of narratives. So myth, for example, in a folkloristic sense, myth refers not to a false story. I love the show Mythbusters, but I hate that use of the word myth. It doesn't mean a false narrative. Rather, a myth is a sacred truth. Often they're cosmogonic narratives, or that is to say narratives about how aspects of the contemporary world came into being. So from a folkloristic perspective, the Genesis creation stories in the Bible, both of them, would be regarded as myth. And that is not a way of dismissing the validity of those stories. Right. It's just a way of classifying them and the attitude with which they are typically held in regard by people. Legends are the stories that are most clearly on display tonight from a folkloristic perspective. And those are stories that are set in historical time, unlike myth, which typically occurs kind of in no time or outside of time or in the beginning, etc. Legends are set in historical time, even though it may be the ancient, far distant past, but they involve real or putatively real figures, characters. They may or may not be supernatural in nature. They often combine elements of the supernatural and other kind of mundane things. So the stories about Mosby, I think, absolutely would constitute legend. They're told as if they might possibly be real. That's not to say that everybody who tells a legend narrative believes in it.
Right.
Quite the contrary. They're usually characterized by debate, but they are making truth claims about the world, and then the audience gets to decide whether or not they accept those truth claims. And then you got folk and fairy tales, and those are stories that are not told as if true. They're very often didactic. That is, they teach a lesson. So like, I think Jack and the Beanstalk is one of the most famous examples of a folk tale, and it has lots and lots of interesting variations. And then personal narratives are stories that I tell myself about my own experiences. And they often connect in meaningful ways with those other genres, most especially legends. So a personal account of an encounter with a banshee would be an example of a personal narrative that is connecting to a legend complex and potentially contributing to the spread and the growth of that legend complex. So I think that to get back to the specific question, how does history connect with these kinds of narratives? I think that they help to put places on the map, and they help to establish senses of pride of place, which is really, really important in an awful lot of ways, from politics to war to just individuals' experiences of their daily lives. Having claims to fame, like having seen a banshee and having a place named after that experience, that literally has the effect of putting a place on a map. Of course, it's not always so literal, but in examining historical narratives, understanding the rhetorical uses of those kinds of narratives can be really important. And folklore is always used really rhetorically, often in the service of politics, and sometimes, unfortunately, in sort of virulent and intolerable ideologies. The most famous example is the Nazi use of folklore during the prior to and during the Second World War.
Some of what you're talking about, not the Nazis part, but the part about putting a place on a map or kind of creating a popular buzz reminds me of some of the things that Joe was going to talk about in terms of how we utilize folk tales as, as a museum or as an institution.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you got me thinking on a couple of things too. I mean, like Anne Marie's stories and some of the things you mentioned. I'm trying to figure out, why and how these get crafted, and it seems like making people feel better about certain things and anxiety are underlying aspects of this. And that kind of definitely gets into what I want to talk about briefly here. But I am curious for you three, and then everyone who's watching this live stream, if you've gone on a ghost tour before, take a drink. I definitely have. Most people have. I remember when I was younger and went with my family to Gettysburg, we made the mistake, I realize now, of asking, this was when ghost tours were just getting started. I was pretty young, but we asked a ranger about ghost tours, and you would have thought we asked, like, where was the British Army in this battle? Look of like anger and horror on this person's face when we asked that. But since then, like, I've spent time in Gettysburg, I've lived in Charleston for years. Ghost tours are everywhere, every night. I mean, this is so ingrained culturally and really in commercialized ways too, for museums and businesses totally surrounding the idea of ghost tours. So what I want to talk about is this idea of dark tourism, which ghost stories are a part of. But what dark tourism is a form of entertainment that highlights violent, sinister, macabre subject matter, and it leads to people visiting places of trauma and tragedy, whether that be of incarceration sites, of genocide, war, assassination, murder. So a kind of a fascination for people who want to go visit these tragic, disturbing sites as a form of entertainment.
Travis's house.
Rude.
Tragic.
Definitely scary in the sense that anyone who's got little kids running around locked at home all the time. So there are historians and I'm sure psychologists and folklorists who have looked at this idea of dark tourism, why it comes about, why it's increasingly very popular. And some of the key things they focus on, I won't get into all the various explanations of it, but I see a common denominator in basically all the things they suggest. And it all goes back to my look at is anxiety. That there are cultural anxieties and current anxieties in people's lives, and studying these tragic things and viewing them and sometimes being entertained by them is a way to safely look at dangerous things, basically indirectly. So ones that don't really affect their own lives. And it seems like increased amounts of anxiety, cultural disassociation, concern about larger aspects. Ty Miles is someone I was reviewing, again, I spoke to her about this in the past, from things like global warming, financial crisis, lack of traditional religious norms, and I'll add pandemic as one that we could probably throw in now for anxiety. I am sure there is someone who's already planning to study Netflix searches to see what people are watching while they are locked in their homes for months on end. I'm guessing it's probably a lot of murder mysteries and things like that.
Tiger
I've heard
King.
that rentals of that Matt Damon movie, Contagion, skyrocketed at the start of the outbreak.
That's too soon for me. I'm not there.
Yeah, and that could be further proof that public distrust and concern leads to anxiety and leads to people searching out dark tourism in these kind of ways. But ghost stories are one aspect of dark tourism, and they're typically seen as the more frivolous kind of it, that this is just a lighthearted form of entertainment, just some fun stories. But what Ty Miles' book on this was so interesting is she shows there's some significant negative ramifications for using ghost stories in combination with history in terms of how people are digesting and what they think they're hearing. And in her book, she gives a great example of this, which looks more broadly at how historic homes in the South use stories of trauma, ghost stories sometimes, to try to tell a wrong narrative of the Old South. And what she said got her book started was from the Weed Sorrel House in Savannah, Georgia. And she went there just for a tour. And on this tour, they focused heavily on an enslaved teenage girl named Molly. And during this tour, they focused on Molly. And then the tour guide explained that Molly was having, as they said it, an affair with the master and house owner, Francis Sorrel. And as the story went on, as she describes, they explained that the mistress of the house caught them in bed together, ultimately jumped out a window and committed suicide. And that not long after that, Molly was found hanged, murdered at the slave quarters. So there's a lot of troubling aspects to this story that they told at the Sorrel House. Maybe the biggest one is the fact that they called this an affair between Molly and Francis Sorrel, who owned her as a legal right. It's a teenage girl, middle-aged man in the story they told. That's not an affair, that's rape. There is no, level of consent in that kind of dynamic within that relationship. And two, the story that they told, the victims here were both women and somewhat absconded the white male in this Old South story, which fits more broadly with her saying that these stories sometimes were used to paint a nostalgic view of the Old South. It reminded me of some of the things Anne Marie had mentioned about Mosby and stories that pop up about him. But for Ty Miles, she went and did more research, intrigued by the story of Molly. And what she found, looking back, there's no historical record of anyone named Molly. The site actually made it up for entertainment value. So not only was this not just sensationalized, but completely fabricated to tap into people's interest in these kind of stories, but then to tell a historic house tour at the same time. So I think that's a great example of really the destructive nature potentially of kind of using ghost stories in relation to history. But of course they are popular, and there's different levels of that. And we have an example, for the Loudoun Museum as well. Our most popular fundraiser and the most well-known thing that we're known for is the hauntings tours every October. And when I moved here and learned more about the hauntings tours, and I listened to some of the things that people who've been doing it for literally decades told me, they were very passionate about it, and passionate in the fact that they are able to tell a lot of people who go on these tours a lot of interesting history about downtown Leesburg, spanning multiple centuries. That this is a great way to captivate people. And there's a story that some of the haunting stories mentioned that then reminded me when I was reading again Ty Miles' book. And it's from the 1700s, and an enslaved person named Mercer, who's put on trial at the courthouse in Leesburg by the Royal Colonial Court in 1768. And within this trial, Mercer is charged and accused and found guilty of murder, and supposedly admitted guilt to that murder and confessed to it. And as the verdict read from this again in 1768, therefore it is considered by the court that the said Mercer for his offense be hanged by the neck until he be dead, and that the sheriff bring said Mercer to the gallows and then hang him pursuant to the aforesaid judgment, and then sever his head from his body and place the same on a pole near said gallows, and also set up his 4 quarters. And then it comes a little bit and it says, and the court values the said slave at 70 pounds current money. So I kind of paraphrase in some packs to cut some of the parts out. But from that, you're hearing, if you just read things again on the surface level, and if you do things like the Weed Sorrel House, you're hearing about a slave who killed someone and then was beheaded and murdered, and potentially, spirits at the courthouse. Maybe it's Mercer the murderer or something like that. But I think you do get moments of providing real important history on some of these stories, where when you think more deeply at it, and when you have a chance to explain this, if you tell a story like this, the dynamic of 1768. Mercer is viewed as legal property. You can see that by the line in the verdict, and the court values him at 70 pounds. So again, it shows their value is in what this person is, the kind of chattel principle. From this story though, if you look at, okay, if they're viewed property and no rights, what kind of trial would someone like this get if they were going to be actually accused of something? It's going to be an all white male jury who doesn't view them as a resident or as a citizen once it's the United States. So that's not a fair trial. So who knows what kind of coerced confession could have potentially come from Mercer. And beyond that too, this is a key way of showing how people try to maintain social order. The biggest anxiety, again, we mentioned anxiety a few minutes ago, the biggest anxiety in a slave society is slave rebellion. The best way to do so is through violence and intimidation to maintain social order against any sort of slave uprising and rebellion throughout a slave community. So for the fact that they hang Mercer and it claims, basically dismembers him, I don't see any proof of that actually happening. But again, that is violence as a way to reduce anxiety and for social order. So, a story that maybe talks about several sorts of spirits at a courthouse, I mentioned maybe some trials, does provide opportunities to get into important history of local communities and help bring people together for entertainment to get kind of essentially, hypothetically, in the door to learn more local history about what's surrounding them, in their communities all the time.
I think that's fascinating. And that's a really good, I encourage folks in the audience, like if you're going on tours like these, think about who is giving the tour. There are plenty of museums that are, because I'm also thinking about our program, which is Legends by Lantern Light, in which we're telling some of these historical stories at night. We're trying to have some of that spooky feeling. But of course, the idea, as Joe is pointing out, is like to tell the real story, and to not, dramatize things that frankly are already hard-hitting and truthful in themselves. And I think that, Joe, I think you'll agree with me on this. It's kind of summing up some of what you were saying too, that we have a responsibility to do some of the truth telling, and to correct some of these, legends, trying to use the correct terminology now, Jeff, some of these legends that have been, perpetuated and maybe twisted or added to.
Yeah, I can only agree. I think you guys are exactly right. And maybe one of the most famous instances in American history of the sort of powerful rhetorical usage of supernatural narratives in a really heinous way is the Salem witch trials. And just as you suggested, Joe, if one were to just focus on the sort of superficial, surface level narratives that grew out of that time without doing the important and very hard work of contextualizing them, one could arrive at very, very different conclusions from the reality of screwed up gender dynamics in the colonial era, the harshnesses associated with Puritanism, and all of the other kinds of structural inequalities that were baked into that series of events without carefully historicizing. So yeah, I can only agree with you. There are also kind of more contemporary to us ramifications of things like dark tourism in the form of, exactly as you said, fabricated or at least misleading narratives that are just about making a buck. That is not the task of scholars in any field, to propagate that kind of stuff. And
is tourism becoming an increasing aspect of folklore, in your studies? Is that something that's becoming more and more talked about, I guess, with your colleagues?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, a lot of folklorists have that interest in place that I kind of mentioned before. And dark tourism is really fascinating because it so self-consciously connects elements of the past and history as popularly understood with all these contemporary concerns, finances and economic factors, local identity. Usually tourist functions of many different kinds are kind of characterized by this weird tension. Like on the one hand, local economies depend on them. On the other hand, people typically hate tourists and roll their eyes when they speak about them. And there are a lot of good reasons. And I'm oversimplifying here a little bit, but yes, the short answer is yes. Folklorists are very interested in dark tourism and ghost tours in particular, for exactly the reasons that you're talking about.
So as professional scholars, is there a use for dark tourism? Is there a place at the table in public history for this kind of stuff? Because you could definitely take the tack that it does open the door to allow us to talk about difficult issues that would normally be ignored. When you go to, like, say, a typical historic house museum, a lot of times, at least historically, it's been about the furniture. It's been about the people who live in the house, like the portraits on the walls. It's not necessarily about these tougher issues of like slavery and violence, illness, death. Is there a middle ground? Is this something we can use?
As someone in the profession, I would have to say yes. I think one of the biggest industries that embraces dark tourism, of course, is the historic sites industry. This idea, and I think, Travis, what you're saying about people want to know the secrets is this also, I think, kind of simultaneous rise of authenticity.
Yes.
Tourists want authenticity. They don't want to hear the happy little tale about the rich plantation owners and how great their world was, because I think we live in a time now that we know there are multiple perspectives. And so it's, again, pulling on Joe's thing too, the anxiety, the tension that exists in telling complicated stories about our past. But I think there's definitely a legitimate way to explore those difficult topics in a way that's still approachable and in bite-sized pieces, that's not making them complete fluff, and then of course in the worst, fabrication.
And I think you also don't want to come across as kind of like gawking at it either,
Exactly.
just drawn to the blood and the guts without really thinking about these issues.
Yeah, and like, good point with the word gawker. This is not a modern phenomenon either. During the Civil War, people were gawkers going to prison camps to look at people in prison. This is not something that's brand new to society. And of course, again, the underlying theme is probably concern within what's going on within their own lives in current times. And if somebody got a question on Facebook too from Gene, a good one about, like, have there ever been any legends that were popular in dark tourism that were subsequently found to be false? And I would say there's a lot of people there's a lot of shades of wrongdoing, or at least myths that go around almost most figures that you think of. None that popped in my head in terms of a completely false one, but same thing with someone like John Mosby. These stories then form in types of nostalgia, and then the person's legacy becomes detached from who the person actually is. It becomes their legend more than the person that people really think of. But they conflate the two because of how many times stories get passed down with one another. And that might be an aspect of folklore as well, how, like, family traditions and family stories, word gets passed down. And then the next thing you know, I mean, the story's taken on a whole life of its own.
I
Right, you're
agree. I think that some of the tales, for example, the one I told about Mosby and the barber's chair, of course, that's not a dark tourism tale. No one is, unless you're Sweeney Todd, you're not freaking out about a barber story. But there are examples of things like I think of as kind of tall tales that are just uncorroborated. Is that the right word? Yes, uncorroborated history. But as far as legends go, a lot of the tricky parts about some of these dark tourism stories is that, as Jeff pointed out, a lot of these are experience-based. So I used to work at the Mary Washington House in Fredericksburg, and there were stories about previous staff members who had heard ghostly sounds. So the rustle of silk skirts as someone walks by, or the laughter of children. And there wasn't a specific story necessarily associated with those, but you can't outright say, you're wrong. You didn't hear any of that. So a lot of times, we could spend our whole careers just trying to debunk, some of these legends, some of these stories that are being told.
I did my dissertation research in Ireland. Oh, and also Penn State. Somebody wrote "We are" in the comments. So
Close to that.
I bet that was Jim Little.
Was it?
Yeah, no, I did my dissertation research in Ireland, and I don't mean to move us too far afield, but I worked for a little time at a place in County Tipperary that was called Ferryfort Farm. And it was called that because my friend Michael, who was the owner, had a ferry fort on his farm. And ferry forts are these Iron Age, probably defensive homestead or farmstead structures. They're usually ring shaped. They're also called ring forts or raths. And he had one behind his farmhouse. So he had a working farm. And he also would kind of invite tourists to come, and he would take them on little tours of the ferry fort. It's not precisely dark tourism, but I think it's touching on something very similar, particularly because in Irish legend, you're really not supposed to screw around with ferry places. You shouldn't go into them normally. But Michael had come to view himself as a custodian of this place, and he felt that if he took care of it and was respectful, that the fairies would treat him well. He did believe literally in the presence of the fairies. During my time there, I learned that Ireland has this very impressive electronic database called it's put together by the National Monuments Service. It's like the Electronic Irish Place Names Database or something like that. I'm sure I'm mangling the name of it, but it's a list of all of the archaeological sites that have been surveyed in Ireland to date. And they have this interactive GIS map that you can access on their website that's amazing. And I used it to find Michael's farm and look at what archaeological information they had about this ferry fort. And according to them, it wasn't a ring fort at all. It wasn't an Iron Age defensive structure. It was actually, I think, a 18th or 19th century garden enclosure. It was kind of like almost like a folly that probably some gentleman English farmer who had originally owned the place built. To mimic a ruin that would have appeared on the Irish landscape. That was the official archaeological stance on it. And I worried a little bit about telling this to Michael. I thought it might, undermine a really important part of his life. And when I told it to him, his response was so beautifully Irish. He thought about it for just a second, and then he said, "Well, that's a load of rubbish." Because he knew what he knew about his place, and then he thought through it very critically. He said, "Well, I don't know what time the fairies moved in. Maybe who knows what the nature
That's
of
true.
Yeah, maybe they showed up in the 1890s.
That's true.
Who knows? Like,
maybe they were very grateful to have a prefabricated ring.
Right.
Could be, right? So I mean, he was really very critical, by which I mean he thought very seriously and very critically about it, and he came to a conclusion that incorporated this new knowledge, which I don't know if he accepted it fully or if he rejected it or what kind of compromise he reached, but he made sense of it based both on his knowledge of the history of his place, but also on his personal experience. And to your earlier question, Joe, I think that if we as scholars can speak to that in a sensitive way, that it definitely is possible to do this in a way that furthers the goal of historical scholarship, but is also respectful to people's experiences of place. I think the point that Travis made about not gawking at things is a very good one.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but think you brought up Salem, been to Salem several times. And, of course, part of it is like the Witch Dungeon Wax Museum. And then, of course, there's all these shops and things that cater to like 20th, 21st century kind of like neo-pagan witches that maybe don't necessarily have any sort of historical connection to the actual events of the 1690s there.
Yeah, that's an important point.
Yes.
Sure.
And it's such it's such a weird place. Yeah, it's so hard to kind of separate out, like kind of what we were talking about, what's useful history and what's kind of just sensationalism.
But I think that what you all are doing right here is a really great answer to how we can deal with this. The fact that, you all have identified these narratives and
We did not pay Jeff to say that.
No, but this is critically important. But the fact that you've identified these narratives and you're working through them in this way, that's precisely, I think, what we all need to be doing.
And for Jeff, what you'd mentioned, and Travis, you'd mentioned, we actually had a question about witchcraft too. So I think this would be an appropriate time to bring it up.
Oh boy.
Is this Elle's question?
It is. So you
I'm-
never know what's coming.
I'm no expert on witchcraft. One thing that actually Jeff and I, when we were talking earlier this week about this, that I did want to talk about maybe a little bit is, my background has been in archaeology and kind of material culture. And one of my favorite things to talk about is the phenomena of witch bottles. These are bottles that are typically buried at like entrances to homes or chimneys, places where spirits can enter the house. They're typically filled with some sort of personal items. You'll see fingernail clippings, urine, hair, as well as iron objects, pins and nails. And the idea being that those personal objects draw the spirit in, draw the witch in, and then the iron nails and stuff trap them in. These originate in southeastern England in the 17th century, but there's about a dozen or so examples that we've found archaeologically here in the United States. In fact, just a year or two ago, they found one in Virginia. And one of the things that made this so unusual is that it was actually in a Civil War era entrenchment down near Williamsburg, which is way later than anyone would have expected to find this. But I think it speaks to this, like what Jeff was talking about, like these things that get passed down from generation to generation to generation. I know there's probably 3 or 4 that have been found in Maryland, maybe more than that. There's a handful in Pennsylvania and in New York. So they're not completely unknown. There's also, kind of along that same lines, the tradition of burying things within walls. You'll see shoes, cats. There's actually, if anyone's ever been to the Carlisle House in Alexandria, there was always this kind of folktale or legend that a cat was buried in the wall there to protect it from spirits. And when they renovated in the 1970s, sure enough, there was like a mummified cat in the wall. So kind of these physical manifestations of these beliefs, Jeff was telling us a little earlier before we went live about bottle trees. Could you talk about that for a little bit? Like, I think that's fascinating.
Oh yeah, well, I'm no expert, but bottle trees are something that can still be seen in parts of the American South, in Maryland and Virginia. They're derived from Congo, from the Congo in Africa. And they're associated with Southern African American culture today. And basically these are trees festooned with bottles. As you were saying, Travis, you're familiar with bottle trees that are not actual trees. They're
it's kind of like a stand with like decorative bottles.
Yeah. Where Travis and I both went to school in Southern Maryland, there was a local witch legend about a witch called Moll Dyer, who was associated with Leonardtown, which was up the road from us. And there's a street named after her in the area. And I distinctly recall seeing a house on the corner of that street that had a tree with tons of bottles hanging in it. And I never spoke to the inhabitant of the house, but I assumed that this was their interpretation of a bottle tree designed to ward off evil spirits.
So would
More
those
violent
bottles
than the
also
story.
have like clippings and pieces in them, or just the act of the bottles would ward away the spirit?
I think that the bottles are supposed to capture the spirit inside. So I don't think these ones that I had seen, I don't think they had anything inside of them. I think they were empty. Oh, well, although there may have been evil spirits inside of them. But
We don't want to find out.
speak for yourself.
Field trip.
Leave
Yeah.
that to the folklorists. Yeah, because I've noticed kind of decorative bottle trees, particularly in African American communities, and it wasn't until we had that conversation that I really kind of put that together, that that's a, you know, part of this legacy. I think whether consciously or not, that's. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think one of the most interesting things about a lot of folklore is a lot of things we do, we don't necessarily think about why we do it. It's
Oh,
just,
absolutely.
you know, like these certain behaviors that we do, like knock on wood or whatever, like we don't think
Yeah,
about
yeah.
the actual belief
Throw a
behind
pinch
it.
of salt over your
Pinch of
shoulder.
salt, exactly, yeah.
Salt.
So,
Yeah, yeah,
I,
survivals happen. Yeah.
so this is not necessarily a witch story, but it is a good local kind of ghost story, and it actually kind of ties into dark tourism too, because the way I found out about this story was actually by reading a Civil War era account. In 1864, there's this fantastic artist named James E. Taylor who's traveling through the Shenandoah Valley with the Union Army, and he sketches literally hundreds of sketches of the valley, of the people there, of buildings and so forth. We actually did a tour based on some of his art last year. So I'm going through and I'm looking at pictures of battlefields and homes and things like that. And then I see this bizarre set of sketches that show like the devil and, you know, like this like weird old like Gandalf looking guy and all these like weird shapes and like kind of esoteric figures and things. And so I was, you know, it really grabbed my attention. And so I read it and found out that this was actually related to a long-standing story of the supernatural out in the Shenandoah Valley that he, you know, he recorded while he was traveling through. And that's the story of Wizard Clip. And I'm sure maybe some of the people Wizard Clip.
So excited.
So the story of Wizard Clip begins at Middleway, West Virginia, or what was then Virginia at the time. So just a little west of where we're sitting now. And in the 1790s, a guy named Adam Livingston moves there from Pennsylvania. And, you know, we kind of touched on this earlier, but one of the things that keeps these folk tales going is people moving from different places, bringing their folk beliefs with them. In this case, Livingston, he's a devout Lutheran, kind of grew up in that Lancaster County area, so very much immersed in the German culture there. So he arrives in Middleway around the 1790s, pretty prosperous farmer, but soon really strange things start to happen, and it depends on which version of the story you read. But according to one, a stranger appears on his doorstep one night and he allows this guy to board in his home. And within a few days, this man is deathly ill. And he's asking for a Catholic priest to come and give him his last rites. And Livingston, being a devout Lutheran, says, no priest is going to cross my threshold, you know, over my dead body kind of thing. And this guy's condition worsens. He dies. He's actually buried out on Livingston's property in an unmarked grave. And from this moment, kind of strange supernatural things begin to occur on the Livingston property. You know, his barn burns down, his cattle start to die. You know, it kind of seems like a run of bad luck. And then he starts hearing like herds of horses running through his house in the middle of the night. Crocks and plates will fly off the shelves and smash, kind of what we think of if like classic poltergeist activity. Burning logs flying out of the fireplace. Probably the scariest thing in my opinion is like his turkeys and geese and stuff, all of a sudden their heads would cut off, like as if someone had come along and like chopped them with an invisible knife. Yeah, that's a bit unnerving. But the really defining thing and the way how this gets the name Wizard Clip is he and his family would hear the sound of like shears cutting almost constantly in the house, and their clothing, their bedding, their curtains would be cut either to ribbons or cut with like a crescent moon shape. And this would even happen to like clothing that they're wearing. Like they talked about, like they would be sitting at the dinner table, they'd hear this noise and like look down, and their clothes would have these shapes cut out of them. On one occasion, one of their neighbors actually comes and she wraps up a silk cap in her pocket in a handkerchief. And when she walks out of the house, she like undoes her handkerchief, pulls out the cap, and it's been cut and it had never left her pocket. So it's really, really strange, really bizarre. But it got the name, Wizard Clip from this weird clipping that would occur there.
Can I just say, I feel bad for this alleged ghost that like he's throwing burning logs out of a fireplace, he's chopping off heads, he's burning down barns, and like he gets the name of like little clippy cues.
Wizard Clip,
I feel a little bad. For
if you go to Middleway, Virginia now, like the historic markers in town actually show a pair of scissors and like a crescent moon based on this story.
Wow.
So Livingston obviously like loses a lot of sleep over this, and he has, according to some accounts, a dream where he sees like a man in a black robe who's like coming to save him. And that eventually leads him to contact some of his Catholic neighbors, who get a Catholic priest to come down from Hagerstown, Maryland, Father Dennis Cahill. And he actually comes and like sprinkles holy water around the house and all this stuff. The clipping continues. So Father Cahill comes back with another priest, and they actually celebrate a mass inside the house. Now, at that moment, the clipping stops, all this kind of weird, the poultry killing and all that stuff ends. Although according to some accounts, a new phenomenon begins. According to some accounts, he starts hearing a voice that like instructs him on good Catholic behavior and like Catholic dogma.
the ultimate revenge.
Right. So it's kind of wild. Livingston and his family actually end up converting to Catholicism, and as like an actual historic tie to this, when he actually wills a portion of his property to the Catholic Church, and they still own it to this day. They run a Catholic retreat there called Priest's Field, that is on this property where this Wizard Clip supposedly happened. And again, I would have known nothing about this story had I not been reading the journal of a Civil War correspondent who 70 years after the fact had heard this story from the inhabitants in town. So it's again, it's a really cool example of how these stories get passed by. And like I said, nowadays, if you're just driving through Middleway, you see these weird crescent moon signs, you would have no idea that it all dates back to this weird kind of supernatural folk story. So
it's wild. I had no idea.
Somebody
that's
should trademark the movie rights to that story.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if it's the most exciting ghost story, but
It's total. Are you kidding me? That's a good ghost story.
I mean, unless you're really worried about your laundry getting cut up, I don't know.
Well, think about all of the slaughtering saving on. You get a ghost to come out and decapitate all your poultry for you.
Decapitate your chickens for you. But yeah, I encourage, like, I know a lot of Civil War buffs have copies of James Taylor's sketchbook. So, check out his illustrations. They're very, very strange, and they're very different from any of the other ones he did. But this story actually gets picked up by the Catholic Church in the late 19th century, and they start publishing this as like an example of, I don't want to use the term miracle necessarily, but of like the power of the Catholic Church over the supernatural.
That's
so it's
amazing.
really weird, kind of cool little story.
So much.
In an area that has a lot of cool folk tales like this.
Yeah, that is fascinating, man. Especially the fact that the church picked it up in that way. That's really compelling.
Yeah, and we're getting, Travis, I don't know if you have more you wanted to say before I bring in the comment section.
No, I figured we'd have a lot of comments and questions on this one, so.
Yeah, and Andrea, again, who's monitoring behind the scenes, said that a lot of people are getting into superstition, and I mean that fits in, I think, with especially with some of the things Travis has just mentioned, and like the ongoing question that I've kept having is religion's role in this. I mean, I was in debating what to talk about this week, and I almost talked about the Great Awakening, which was, you know, societal concerns kind of brought that on, and especially the Second Great Awakening, the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Jeff, what do you think with religion, with superstition, with these stories and folklore? How is that viewed, and how do you think this all fits together?
Wow, that's a complex one. Yeah, well, I mean, like, what period, Travis, did you say the church picked up that narrative? And what was the gap between when it?
It's initially recorded by one of the priests who's there, and then I know it gets published in the 1870s by like a Catholic publisher. So like 80 years later or whatever, really starts to gain traction.
Well, that seems to make a certain amount of sense. You and I were talking earlier this week too about the rise in interest in spiritualism following the Civil War and following several other. Oh, am I jumping the gun?
No, please.
Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff coming out of the Burnover district, you know, spiritualism and its related philosophies were around throughout the 19th century into the present. But they kind of had these resurgences of interest following these major conflicts, following the Civil War, and again, following the First World War. Spiritualism kind of had a reappearance. No, so there's a lot to unpack. I'm really interested in what we call vernacular religion, right? So vernacular, again, just means ordinary, common, everyday, as opposed to the sort of official doctrine of different religious institutions. In reality, everybody who lives a religious life is living a vernacular religious life. It's just religion as it is lived, is how it was famously defined. So the emphasis on personal experience of the divine is something that really did gain a great deal of traction in that period in American history. Not only within Catholicism, in a lot of different Christian denominations. But the fact that these folk beliefs relating to the occult, relating to magic and witchcraft, were given a sort of Catholic imprimatur, you know, in this way, I think is really fascinating, because the Catholic Church in various places and various points in its history has taken pains to distance itself from some of that. Ireland is another good example. Also in the late 19th century, in 1895, also in Tipperary in Ireland, there's the famous case of a woman named Bridget Cleary, who was, her husband claimed that he believed that she was not in fact his real wife, that she had been replaced by a fairy changeling. And so he and some members of their family burned her to death, essentially. They subjected her to this series of trials to try and drive away the changeling and get the real Bridget back. And it ended in her really horrible death. It was sometimes referred to as the last witch burning in Western Europe. When folk beliefs, we tried, some people feel differently about it. I am not personally a proponent of using the word superstition because that term has a lot of negative baggage connected with it. But folk beliefs of various kinds intersecting with official religious discourses are something that has been of a great deal of interest to folklorists. And I think that something along those lines is going on here. And it really points to something I mentioned earlier in the evening, the rhetorical power of folk narratives. Here seems to be an example of the church really glomming very powerfully on to a particular folk narrative and using that to bolster their own message of divine or infernal power in the world and the need for the church as intercessor. So there's an awful lot of stuff to unpack, but I think it's a fascinating example of why we as historians and scholars should take these narratives seriously, because they have a dramatic impact on the experience of a given place at a given time, and also the way in which we come to think about those places subsequently.
I think it's also interesting to think about, so that tiny town having this confluence of different religious practices as well, you know, and that's coming to a time during the Great Awakening, and then later in the Second Great Awakening, and in this area where we have nationalities all scrambling together, and then within those nationalities, even within, say, the English subset, you have Baptists, Anabaptists, you have Anglicans, you know, you've got mixtures within mixtures, and how those are going to shake out, and how those different communities have their own beliefs that are scrambling in together. So I particularly how he's calling on his Catholic neighbors to band together and help him out, you know, and this idea that they have to, you know, they have to relate, they have to, and the idea that the Catholics would want to help him, you know, in return, and to make a connection.
Yeah, it's
And
funny
the fact that they had to
mention that.
send to Hagerstown for a priest is also.
That's what I was thinking too. They had to go to Hagerstown. There's no
Right.
priest, obviously,
I mean,
not in the Old Dominion.
According to one version of the story, and again, like a lot of good folk tales, that gets repeated and changed, and there's some versions don't involve that Catholic stranger. But in one version, he actually says, like, he goes to a Baptist minister, he goes to a Methodist minister, he goes to, like, a Lutheran minister. But it's the Catholics, of course, who
have the
naturally-
answer.
yeah, like The Exorcist
Naturally.
or whatever. You know, the old.
That's
priest
great.
goes in.
What a fascinating story. I had never heard that before.
It's a strange story. Like I said, it's got a lot of different iterations to it. But
Well, what you're doing here, though, this speaks again to Joe's question from before, like on the topic of dark tourism. How can public historians make these kinds of narratives matter? You know, how can these be used to generate interest, but in a way that is respectful and that pays attention to that historical context that's so critical? And you guys have highlighted all of those connections.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Amory.
It's a very short point, but just wanting to say, like, it's also fascinating to think of James Taylor taking the part of an early ethnographer, writing down this folk tale in a place that he's never been to, in a place that he'll never go back to, in a place that he really doesn't have a stake in, but is recording, you know, this piece of their story, you know. And of course, Taylor was someone who was already interested in American history, we know, you know, was interested in the founding of the country, was writing about founding figures and graves that he encountered here in this area when he was with the army. But the idea that he's the one who told that story, and that's even how people living in that area today are learning about it, is from someone who's removed from the situation.
Right. Actually, one of the first kind of published history of this comes from, as I said, the priest who goes there with Father Cahill, and I can't remember his name, but it's actually a Polish name, and it was a Polish Catholic priest living in America. So, like, you get this totally different old world set of folk beliefs that kind of color how we look at this. And I think that really kind of speaks to what you were talking about earlier. You know, from this one ghost story, we talk about, like, kind of the history of immigration in this area, these different religious groups in this area. There's a Civil War connection, you know, all of this kind of comes together, and this story gives us an avenue to really examine those different topics.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Yeah.
Way cool.
Yeah.
Wizard clip, man.
Let's get some more questions.
Yep.
I'm sure we got more questions.
Comments.
We got a few minutes left, but you know, in the few minutes we have remaining, we've got some interesting questions here. Let me pull up the one from Bernadette. So Bernadette, she asks, I don't know if this is more of a Travis because of Rev War, or if this is more Jeff, but did folklore beasts like the Jersey Devil or the Snallygaster play any part during the Revolutionary War?
Oh, wow.
Take a step back on this one.
So, you know, I'm no expert on the Jersey Devil, I'll say that, but the Snallygaster is a Frederick County, Maryland kind of creature. Comes from that Germanic tradition, Snallygaster from Schnellgeist, fast ghost or quick spirit, or wherever you want to translate it. Supposedly this monster flying creature. I hate to burst your bubble, Burn. I'm so sorry. The Snallygaster is a 20th century invention. The history of it does not go very deep. It's an early 20th century creation that by all accounts, by all research, was basically invented to kind of sell newspapers.
So the original dark tourism, right?
Now the Jersey Devil, again, I'm not an expert. From what I understand, there some iterations of the Jersey Devil legend do kind of trace it back to the Revolutionary War and kind of the conflict in New Jersey between loyalists and patriots and kind of all the blood that was spilt during that time. You know, kind of like the Headless Horseman and Washington Irving stories, or what we were talking about earlier. These eras of great trauma, of great violence, kind of breed these legends. But I am no expert on the Jersey Devil. I'm sorry.
Yeah, neither am I. And there's a recent book that came out, and full disclosure, I've not read it yet. I have it on my shelf, but I've not read it. But it's called The Secret History of the Jersey Devil, how Quakers, hucksters, and Benjamin Franklin created a monster. So there seems to be at least some opinion in the scholarly community that the Jersey Devil was a product of, well, a number of different streams of discourse, but kind of points to all the things that Travis just mentioned. And it also illustrates how the media, broadly understood, can get involved.
And like, let's not overlook the fact that there's a hockey team called the New Jersey Devils. I don't know the history behind. I've never thought much about the name at all. I mean, I'm a Buffalo Sabres fan, so I have nothing. Kevin Pollak can attest. We have nothing to be proud of. But the Devils, I mean, I never thought much about the name, but it also shows how these stories and maybe some of these myths and folklores fit within our lives that we don't even realize are surrounding us.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I was thinking about through all this is, you know, Anne Marie and I work for the Mosby Heritage area, and that area, kind of broadly defined, is the area of Mosby's Confederacy. This almost, I mean, it's historically based. It's the area where Mosby operated, but it becomes, over the course of, you know, 1863, 64, 65, a legend in his own time that, like, this is a place where it is not safe for Union troops to enter, that this is a place where Mosby reigns. He's like a Robin Hood in Sherwood
Camelot.
Forest.
Yes, it's like exactly. A Camelot Robin Hood, and it's loosely defined depending on who's actually writing about, you know, where is Mosby's Confederacy, where are the defining boundaries of it, you know, all that.
Yeah, and I know we're out of time, but like that reminded me of a point I thought of earlier when you were talking about how there's heroes and villains in a lot of these stories, that it becomes black and white in so many ways. And again, probably goes back to people trying to find comfort, weirdly enough, in certain things and the heroes that they maybe have.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't even get to touch on like the spiritualism in how people deal with the mass slaughter of the Civil War, which was like
that could be a whole lot.
In all the wars, really.
That's for another time, I guess.
Actually, and that time might not be coming up too far away from now either, because we do have, we are of course doing upcoming histories on tap as well. I'm trying to remind myself before I misspeak, because next week we are going to talk about the memory of war and how veterans are kind of understood and treated after the wars in which they fought. So looking at a retrospective, but kind of within a couple generations of each war, from the Revolution up to World War I and I think World War II as well. So some of what we've talked about tonight, I think will come back a little bit next week.
Yeah, I think we've got another tool kind of in our toolbox to really look at next week's discussion and think about it in a critical way that we maybe wouldn't have before. So.
Folklore.
And thank you to Jeff, of course, for coming out and sharing his wide knowledge base. Yeah, cheers.
Oh, you guys are the pros. I'm just the peanut gallery.
So thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. Again, Anne Marie and I are with the Mosby Heritage Area, Joe Rizzo from the Loudoun Museum. If you enjoy this kind of content, please consider donating to these organizations. Please consider maybe a membership to these organizations. You know, that helps us create more great content like this. Huge thanks to Jeff for coming out tonight and talking about this stuff with us. Jeff, is there a place people can reach you if they have questions about folklore?
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to drop me an email. My university email is it's on the Penn State site. It's jat639@psu.edu.
Great.
Feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to chat.
And if we didn't get to anybody's questions, I know we had a couple from Elle about witchcraft. They're pretty maybe specific. So Jeff, I'm sure if you wouldn't mind maybe going through some of the comments too.
Sure, absolutely.
Awesome.
Thanks, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you next week.